Okay. So, bit of an odd talk this. It's got two levels to it, a kind of community level and a conceptual level, which I would like your help with. And it's not about web archiving. It's about the relationship between theory and practice in this field, and what I kind of think of as the tyranny of it depends. So, for me, digital preservation looks a bit like this. So way up at the top there, we have these kind of universal ideas, these kind of big picture things, and particularly things of the dominant position of OIS in digital preservation and things like that. So models and guidelines and theories, which are supposed to be universal, and we're all supposed to know about, and it's all supposed to help us all do digital preservation. But then if you look at the practical, which is also well represented at events like this, and you look at the policies and the workflows and the architectures and the tools, there's hundreds of decisions that end up being made between those big pictures that all apply to all of us and getting it done on the ground. And to me, it feels like there's some kind of gap here. I don't even know, I'm not saying I'm right about this, but like, I don't know what the right solution is, but to me it feels like there's a missing bit, and people kind of wander around in this gap between the two, and they turn up in mailing lists and they go, well, how do I do this? Well, I need to solve this. And the answer comes back, it depends, right? So the thesis underlying this presentation is that we need something like patterns and maps. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. Patterns, I'm kind of borrowing from design patterns and other kind of language in computer science and related fields, where perhaps if we looked at those workflows in the collaboratively on workflows wiki, and at the policies in different institutions, looked at all those papers we've published all over the years, we'd be able to see common patterns. Although things look very different between our institutions because of how we frame things and the context we're in, maybe we'd find there are common patterns across these contexts, and we'd be able to work out what the contextual factors are which drive these decisions. And if we could find those patterns and the context, maybe we could come up with some kind of map that would help us work out our position in that context and why we make these different decisions in different areas. This is a very vague idea, and this is going to be a fairly vague talk, so bear with me. To try and to build a set of I'm only going to be able to talk about patterns today, and although I came across patterns first in software engineering, researching this brought me back to an older publication called A Pattern Language, which was actually the same idea, but about having a hierarchy of patterns for building built environments, for building cities, towns, and villages. And this book was hoping to capture these patterns so people could not solve the same problems all over again in different ways. So that's some of the inspiration. And just to try and get the idea across in the time I've given myself, should have been a long paper, I'm just going to talk about one pattern, and I'm not even sure I'm right this is a real pattern, but I'd like to describe it to you. And unfortunately, I'm going to invoke OAIS. I apologize in advance. Now, I have a complicated relationship with OAIS, but there's at least one bit I like. And in my opinion, this part of it is very clear and quite prescriptive, because it says, quite simply, that the SIP's the thing that comes in the door, right? And the archival package is the thing you keep and is generated from the SIP. And then the dissemination version, whatever access copy you have, is generated from the archival version, right? So that is an information flow for your organization, which I think of as the line, right? And it seems to me to be very prescriptive about this. Often you can argue about OS, or it's being very high level, but this seems unarguable, and I really like it. I know this seems really simple, but I really like it for a very simple reason, because if you made the access version from the archive, you know all the bits of the access version are in the archive, right? Because that's how you made it. You definitely know gaps. There's definitely nothing that got lost at the side or came in from another thing, because you actually took the archival version and made the access version from it. So this seems very sensible, and of course I like it. This is how web archives work, right? We take walks and logs in, and we keep them in our archive, and actually we do it all on the fly. We generate access copies, and we modify them and do format transformations and stuff, and it's all dynamic when we generate them. And certainly the UK Web Archive works like this, and the Internet Archive. And in fact, in general, the Internet Archive is like this. Now, of course, their documentation doesn't talk about SIPs and DIPs and all that nonsense, because no one cares. They talk about items, and I think wisely they focus on the processes, describing the processes that describe the transitions between these states, not describing the states. So they've got good documentation on uploading, which is ingesting the item, right? And on what they call derivation, which is where all the variants you need to enable access are created. So that's great. So I don't know if that seems obvious or even trite, I don't know, or what to you guys, but that is, I like that. So how can this not be the case? What other information flow patterns are there? Well, the obvious one is what I think of as the stop, right? So you can have a dark archive or a dim archive, an archive where you don't really generate access packages or, well, I'll give some examples because that'll probably help. So one of the examples I think of is eJournal archives. So these could run for years and years and years, and then after, 3 decades, the publisher goes, nah, the trigger's fired, and then you have to give access. And that's why this is so hard, right? Because they've got to spend all that time making sure it's going to work on that day one. So they have to simulate access in order to make sure it's going to work when the time comes, which is why their ingest is so expensive and their processing so expensive, because they have to know it's going to work. And so what I'm arguing is, because they operate under this different pattern, you need to be aware that new risks arise that you have to head off, right? And so this, and so that's an example where I think it's working. I can give plenty of web archive examples where this didn't work, right? So back in the 90s, we got a load of stuff. Who remembers VRML? Anybody remember VRML? Yeah, lovely stuff, right? Guess what? The crawler didn't pass VRML. We never tried to play it during the crawl at the time. So if it needed textures, or if it linked to other VRML files, we didn't get them. And you can't preserve what you never got in the first place. So because we didn't simulate or enable access to Java applets, Flash, or VRML, things like that, during crawl time back in the day, we never got the things. So I'm arguing if you run a dark archive, the primary additional risk you face is you miss the dependencies that you need to build access. So that's the first two. And then there's one more pattern I'd like to describe, which is the fork. So this is where, unlike the kind of OIS prescription, you actually generate the access version and the archival version from the original submission information package before it gets to your store. And this is actually quite common. So one context I've seen this happen is upstream forks. So I won't mention anybody in particular, any organizations in particular, but there was a case, a digitization program. We were partnering with someone was partnering with it was a long time ago, was partnering with a vendor to do digitization, and then they're making their preservation masters, and we're having those, that's great. Then we go, well, we'd like access copies, or we're going to make them ourselves. That looks tricky, they could do it really easily, all right? So we do them upstream, and so what's happened is our SIP is actually already the DIP and the AIP, the access and the dissemination one together. Are they consistent? Well, they could not be now because we didn't have any insight into the process how they were generated. So it's possible that they become inconsistent and we can no longer remake the DIP. And without going into details, this has happened in a digitization project. We were given dissemination packages which we could no longer completely generate from the archival packages due to a little bit of missing metadata. However, beyond that, this happens a lot in pre-ingest normalization where there are access copies and preservation copies. So certainly for, I've not looked at all the tools. For Rosetta and Archivomatica, their default modes of operation generate the AIP and the dissemination copy, the access copy, during the pre-ingest phase, long before it hits the store, right? And then that DIP is used to provide access. Now, I'm not saying this is bad. I'm saying because you've introduced the possibility of them being inconsistent, which before, if you did the line, was guaranteed by the architecture, you have to put in some kind of check to make sure everything's okay. So Archivomatica is open source, so I could go and check what it does. And it does something quite sensible. Because it's made that decision, and it has to do this to ensure all the information is still there, it always, during that pre-ingest phase, it always embeds by default, it embeds the whole SIP inside the archival package. So this kind of neatly sidesteps the issue. So although you can't prove you can generate, your architecture isn't proving you can generate the DIP from the preservation masters, say, you've still got the SIP in there, so you should always be able to go back and fix things up. So I don't know if that, maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, I don't know, but to me this is interesting in that you have OS itself, which to me prescribes this structure that many of us don't do, where we always ingest first, and looking at the normalization case from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France as well this morning, we often do a lot of pre-processing compared to what OS seems to prescribe, But then if you do it like that, maybe fixes mean you have to keep putting a lot of stuff back and keep versioning your AIPs, and a lot of us don't like that. So maybe, although I'm arguing these patterns aren't OAS conformant, I'm saying it may still be the right balance of risks, because if you do stuff up front, you find problems early. So a dark archive has this additional risk of misdependencies, and then if you do your pre-processing early, it opens up the possibility of there being inconsistent information packages, but you can fend off that risk as long as you know that that is a possibility, and it has the advantage of ensuring that you kind of verify and validate things early in the life cycle. So I hope that made some sense. I've been anyway. So that's one pattern, and so my kind of question to you all is kind of two levels. Is that pattern valid and interesting and useful or not? Maybe it's not, right? And also at the higher level, is this kind of approach, trying to find patterns and archetypes across different systems and implementations as a way of navigating the complexity, a useful approach to designing digital preservation systems? Thank you.
Andy told me before we started that he's going to eat into the question time, but we actually still have time for one question, and we will have time for more questions at the end of the session when we have a Q&A with the three speakers. So does anybody have a question for Andy? Or from the online audience? Thomas?
Perhaps. Thank you very much for putting that in light. I think we have experimented those three things from depending on our maturity, in fact. I think, as you say, when you see inconsistency, then we try another pattern and go with the other risks and then iterate again until we have the pattern we like, which is the OAS one, so it's great. Thanks a lot for the insights.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy.